All right, strap in everyone, because today we're going deep into AutoHotkey.
That's right.
And especially for our listeners out there who are thinking of taking the plunge,
Yeah.
you're interested in version 1 versus version 2.
Huh.
What are the big differences? Why should I pick one over the other?
Right.
And we've got a ton of resources from the AutoHotkey community to help us out with this.
It's a great community.
Tutorials,
Yeah.
change logs, sample scripts.
Yeah, it's an exciting topic for sure.
It really is. And when I'm looking at these change logs, it really seems like V2 wasn't just like a little update.
Right.
To V1, it seems like a complete overhaul.
Yeah, it's a pretty major departure.
For someone who's coming from V1 and has been using it for years,
Right.
what would you say is the biggest shift that they're going to have to kind of wrap their head around?
Well, I think the most fundamental change is in how V2 handles instructions.
Okay.
You see, V1 was a little bit of a mix of using older commands and newer expressions. And this led to a lot of inconsistencies, particularly with how it used percent signs and quotation marks.
Right.
It was like trying to speak two languages at once.
Yeah. I'm looking at this V1 script right here. Run percent notepad, PIE, PID, and yeah, I think even I'm getting a little headache.
Exactly. And in V2, that same command becomes very simply run notepad, PID.
Okay.
Much cleaner,
Yeah,
right?
cleaner.
And this consistent use of expressions throughout V2 makes it much easier to learn and remember,
Yeah.
especially for people who are new to scripting in general.
So V2 is kind of like a brand new language with simplified grammar.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah,
But I want to get a little bit more specific.
sure.
I found this simple script in the V1 beginner tutorial.
Okay.
It's J, send my first script.
All right.
Can you break this down for our listeners who've never seen AutoHotkey code before?
Absolutely.
What is going on here?
So this script is basically saying, when I press Ctans plus J, do something.
Okay.
So the J part, that's your hotkey combination. The curly braces enclose the actions that'll happen when you press that hotkey.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, it's the send command, which types out my first script wherever your cursor is.
So if you had that script running in the background and you hit Ctrl plus J,
Right.
it'll just type that out.
Exactly.
Now, how would that same script look in V2?
Well, the core functionality would be the same.
Right.
It would still type out my first script.
Uh-huh.
But V2 just polishes up the syntax a little bit to make it more readable.
Oh, okay.
It's like taking a first draft and making it into a final draft.
Okay, so smoother and more intuitive.
Right.
I'm already seeing why they're saying V2 is more beginner-friendly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, it's not just hotkeys where things have changed, right?
No, there are many other changes.
Like, for example.
For example, if you need to call functions from external code libraries, something called deal call.
Right.
In V1, you had to use this thing called the address operator,
Oh, cool.
which was an ampersand symbol, and to point to the memory location of something. V2 simplifies this by letting you work directly with buffer objects.
So you don't need that symbol anymore.
Exactly.
You just give it the buffer and it knows what to do.
That's right.
Okay, so less symbolic juggling. I like it.
Yeah.
What other syntax changes come to mind?
Well, for one, working with graphical user interfaces, or GUIs,
Okay.
becomes much more organized in V2.
Huh?
You interact with GUI elements by using variables rather than their names.
So it's like having little labels for your tools.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of just having them all scattered on a table.
Exactly.
Okay, so more organization, less chance of mixing things up.
Right.
Any other examples?
Even something as simple as string formatting,
Okay.
which is just dealing with text within your script.
Uh-huh.
In V2, you can use single quotes to enclose a piece of text that contains double quotes without needing to escape those double quotes.
Okay.
It's a subtle change,
Right.
but it just makes your code less cluttered and easier to read.
So it seems like a lot of the changes are about just making it more readable.
Exactly. Readability is a major focus in V2.
Less headache-inducing.
That's right.
Okay, so let's say I'm trying to convince my friend who's brand new to AutoHotkey
Okay.
to start with V2.
Sure.
What would be like our killer argument?
Well, I think one of the biggest arguments for V2 is that it's just much easier to learn.
Okay.
We've already talked about the simplified and consistent syntax,
Right.
but V2 also has much better error detection.
So it catches things before they become a problem.
Exactly. It's like having a tutor looking over your shoulder.
And it's better to catch those things early
Yes, definitely.
than later on when your script's 10,000 lines long.
Absolutely. It helps you build good habits from the beginning.
Okay, so less time spent deciphering those cryptic error messages.
Right.
More time actually like learning and scripting.
Exactly.
What else should we add to our why V2 is awesome list?
Well, V2 is also more future-proof.
Okay.
It's actively being developed.
Right. It's being supported. There are updates coming out.
Right.
So you're not learning a dead language. It's learning something that's going to continue to grow.
That's right.
Anything else?
Well, and one more thing is that the AutoHotkey launcher actually lets you run both V1 and V2 scripts side by side.
Oh, nice.
So you can actually explore both worlds without any hassle.
So even if you've got legacy scripts from V1,
Right.
you're not stuck.
Exactly.
You can still run them.
You can run them both.
All right. Well, it sounds like V2 is the clear winner for starting your AutoHotkey journey.
I would agree.
But hold on. What about objects?
Yeah.
I'm seeing all this stuff about map and array subtypes and all this.
Right.
Is that something that a beginner should even worry about right away?
It's definitely something that's worth understanding,
Okay.
but it's not as intimidating as it sounds.
All right.
So basically, in V1, everything was treated as a basic object.
Okay.
And this sometimes led to code that wasn't very well structured.
Uh-huh.
So V2 introduces these distinct object types,
Like maps and arrays.
like maps and arrays, right? Just to keep things more organized and efficient.
So it's like having specialized containers
Exactly.
for your data instead of just like throwing everything into one big box.
That's a great analogy.
All right. So maps for key value pairs, arrays for lists of items.
Right.
That makes sense.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of AutoHotkey.
We're picking up right where we left off.
That's right.
Talking about all the cool things that V2 has.
Yeah.
And last time we were getting into objects
Yes.
and how V2 introduces these specialized types
Mm,
like maps and arrays.
exactly.
There were those specialized containers we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
They're really about making your code cleaner and more efficient.
Right.
It's like having separate drawers for your socks and your shirts
I like that analogy.
instead of just throwing everything into one big pile.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
But I got to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on like how these things actually work in practice.
Sure.
Could you give me like a real world example
Yeah, absolutely.
of when you might use one of these things?
So let's say you're building a script to manage your movie collection.
Okay.
In V1, you might have used a basic object to store information about each movie,
Uh-huh.
but it could get a little messy if you're dealing with titles, directors, release years, all that.
Right.
That's where maps come in handy.
Okay.
You can create what are called key value pairs.
Right.
So you would have a key like title, and its associated value would be like Casablanca.
Right.
Another key would be director. The value would be Michael Curtiz,
Okay.
and so on.
So it's like you're creating a digital filing system for your movies.
Exactly.
Each piece of information has its own little labeled folder.
That's a great way to think about it.
I can see the appeal there. What about arrays?
Okay, so arrays are perfect when you have a list of items that belong together. Like, for instance, a sequence of actions in your script
Oh.
or a list of your favorite actors.
Right.
You could have an array of movie titles, and you can access each title by its numerical position in that list.
Right.
It's like having a numbered queue for your movie marathon.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So maps for like organized data storage,
Right.
arrays for ordered lists.
Exactly.
Okay, but how do you actually create these things in V2?
Yeah, so creating a map is really easy.
Okay.
You use the map function,
Okay.
and you just list out your key value pairs.
Okay.
So, for example, you could say movie data, map title, Casablanca, director, Michael Curtiz.
And then for arrays.
For arrays, you can use the array function,
Okay.
or you can simply enclose your items in square brackets.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, you could say favorite actors, Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman.
Wow, that's really intuitive.
Yeah, it's designed to be very straightforward.
V2 is really living up to its reputation for user-friendliness.
It really is.
But remember those closures we mentioned earlier?
Yes.
They sound kind of mysterious.
They do sound a little mysterious.
Can you shed some light on what those are?
Yeah, so basically a closure is a function that carries a little bit of memory with it. Okay. So even after the main part of your script has moved on, the closure can still remember certain values from its environment.
So it's like a function with a built-in memory bank.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
But when would you actually use that?
So let's say you're building a script to generate unique IDs for each item in a database.
Okay.
You could use a closure to create a counter that increments every time a new ID is needed.
Okay.
The closure would remember the last ID that was generated,
Right.
so that each new one is unique, even if other parts of your script are doing their own thing.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So it's like having a little assistant
Yeah,
keeping track of the numbering system for you.
exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something that can be a real headache, especially for beginners.
Yeah.
Debugging.
Uh-huh.
We talked about error handling,
Right.
but what other kind of tools or tricks does V2 offer when it comes to debugging?
So V2 still has those classic debugging functions like list bars and
Yeah.
pause, which let you peek into the state of your script as it's running. But there are some really cool enhancements as well.
Oh, like what?
Well, remember how V2 catches a wider range of potential errors?
Right.
Those error messages now often include specific suggestions for fixing the problem.
So it's like having a built-in tech support team.
Exactly. It can be really helpful.
That's way better than just getting a cryptic error message
Right.
and having no idea where to even start.
Exactly.
So what else is new?
Well, there's also what's called a stack trace,
Okay.
which is basically a breadcrumb trail that shows you the exact path your script took before hitting the error.
That's cool.
It can be incredibly useful for pinpointing the source of the issue.
Yeah, no more like endless guesswork.
Right.
Just follow the breadcrumbs.
Exactly.
So it seems like everything in V2 is really geared toward making scripting more accessible,
It
from the syntax to the debugging tools.
really is.
It just seems like it wants you to succeed.
Exactly. That's the goal.
I'm loving this deep dive into V2.
Me too.
We've seen how it streamlines the way you write code.
Yeah.
It introduces all these powerful features like maps and arrays and closures,
Right.
and it makes debugging way less painful.
Absolutely.
I'm actually feeling a lot more confident now
That's great.
about tackling some more complex projects.
It's the goal.
But there's still more.
There's always more.
There's still more to explore, and in the final part of our deep dive,
Yes.
we're going to discover how V2 lets you create standalone applications from your scripts,
That's right.
which makes them super easy to share.
Exactly.
Standalone applications, this sounds really cool.
It is. It's one of the coolest features.
I can't wait. Welcome back for the final part of our AutoHotkey deep dive.
We're in the home stretch.
It's been an amazing journey exploring V2, hasn't it?
It really has. We covered a lot of ground.
We really have, from like simplifying the syntax to the object-oriented stuff to be debugging tools.
All the cool new features.
And you even mentioned turning scripts into standalone applications.
Yes.
That sounds like magic.
It's one of the most exciting things about V2, I think.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does this even work?
So imagine you've written this really awesome AutoHotkey script
Okay.
that automates some task or adds some cool functionality to your computer.
Uh-huh.
And now you want to share this with a friend or a colleague,
Okay.
but they don't have AutoHotkey installed on their machine.
Right.
Well, with V2, you can actually bundle your script into a self-contained executable file
Oh, wow.
using a tool called Act2xe.
So it's like packaging my script into this neat little program
Exactly.
that anyone can run.
Yes.
They don't need any extra software or anything.
Nope.
That's incredible.
It is really cool.
So essentially, Act2xe takes my script,
Right.
merges it with the AutoHotkey interpreter,
Yes.
and wraps it all up into an executable.
Exactly. You can even include any necessary files like images or sound effects.
So it's like a fully portable app.
It is a truly portable application.
Now, does compiling like this affect the performance at all?
Not really. In most cases, the performance difference is pretty negligible.
Okay.
The main advantage of compiling is portability
Right.
and ease of distribution.
Makes sense.
Plus, if you're sharing your script with others, compiling helps protect your source code.
Okay, so it's like giving someone a delicious cake instead of the recipe.
I like that.
They get to enjoy the results without needing to know all the ingredients.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive,
We have.
from syntax changes and object-oriented concepts to error handling and even compiling scripts.
Yeah, we really dug deep.
I hope you've all enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
Me too.
And remember, if you're new to AutoHotkey, or even if you're a seasoned pro looking to check out V2,
Yeah,
don't be afraid to dive in.
that's right.
There's a great community out there ready to help you.
Absolutely.
Happy scripting, everyone.